Happy Saturday, Risers. We hope you're all having a fantastic weekend. Sagar and I are back with some of our favorite moments from this week. National conversations about race have called for the cancellation of a lot of people, especially those willing to go against the left, including Sagar.
Yes,
friend of the
right.
show. And journalist Matt Taibbi weighed in on the shaming tactics of self-described liberals who are coming for journalism.
I'm using an umbrella term to describe a style of thought that I think is primarily emanating from the academia, but has come into the media of late, where it's bullying in tone, it's accusatory, it uses shaming tactics, and it doesn't particularly believe in civil liberties. It's very illiberal in its conception of the world. It does, you hear quite a lot from people who have subscribed to this movement that traditional notions of fairness and balance don't work, so we have to try something else, right? So what I'm describing, I think, really is more the left than traditional liberal, than what you might call liberalism, or the centrist liberals. I do think that one example, in a couple of examples, we've seen the Democratic Party, which is, I think, distinct from the left. They've adopted like the language of intersectionality when they felt it suits them. Like with Bernie Sanders in 2016, they started calling him a sexist and racist and saying that he was an old white cis male who was out of touch with identity politics. You will see that, but I think that language and that tactic comes more from what we would call the left than it does from, say, the Democratic Party.
Matt is so thoughtful on these issues, and this was in response to a long piece that he wrote that laid out a few different instances. One guy, I'm forgetting his name, who got fired apparently for accurately citing a study. Li Feng, who faced blowback over an interview that he posted from a protester that people found controversial about black-on-black crime. And then the Tom Cotton op-ed, which we've talked about here a number of times. One of the things that I asked Matt, because I think his view has been caricatured in particular on the Tom Cotton op-ed of like, oh, he thinks any fringe view should be lifted up on the New York Times. Yes. Like Nathan Robinson described it as like any scrawling on the bathroom wall should be lifted and elevated in the New York Times. And so I asked him about, are there certain things that should be out of bounds? He's like, of course, right? Of course. I just don't think that the Tom Cotton op-ed fits because he's articulating a view that's held by a lot of Americans and is being promoted by the President of the United States. So and he's a United States Senator. So how can you say that this is so beyond the pale that it doesn't even deserve a place or a hearing in the pages of the New York Times?
Yeah, I think that's the right way to look at it. And I thought that Matt's response was very thoughtful. I really encourage everybody to go watch the full interview. All right, so the Organization of American States also cited widespread deliberate fraud over the re-election of former Bolivian President Evo Morales. But friend of the show, Glenn Greenwald, he explains why the New York Times embraced a new report as a reason to remove Morales from his elected position, despite doubt cast on the claims of corruption by researchers. Really interesting. Let's take a listen.
Even this article didn't, it forgot to mention when pointing out that the OAS study was very flawed, that the New York Times itself relied upon it, both in its news reporting and in its editorializing, about affirming the idea that Morales fled. And so did a lot of other kind of prominent people. Michael McFaul, the senior Obama national security official, was ambassador to Russia, and several other kind of high officials and people in media, just proclaimed definitively that the attack on democracy came not from the coup plotters, not from the unelected right-wing faction that continues to run Bolivia 7 months later without an election. No, they weren't the attackers of democracy. They were the defenders of democracy in this story. The attacker of democracy was Evo Morales, the person who won 4 consecutive popular elections. And even the people who went on Twitter and elsewhere to proclaim that democracy has been saved by the coup, which is the standard Cold War script whenever a left-wing government that's elected is overthrown with the help of the U.S., it's always proclaimed to be a defense of democracy rather than an attack on it. None of those people, including the New York Times, has acknowledged responsibility, has said, look, when we said this back in October and November, we relied on an OAS study that appears to have been flawed. There's no accountability. You can always be a puppet for U.S. foreign policy with no accountability.
Yeah.
I think Glenn is right. It's so important in order to make sure we call that out, which is like, look, like you desire that you want is like if you're gonna get it through these types of means, then you're gonna be called hypocritical, right? And that's something that the New York Times just kind of refuses to look at here, which is they're like, oh, it's a terrible abdication of democracy, and then they're like, well, actually, no, their own New York Times reporting says otherwise, and then just the silence on this issue is pretty deafening, given about who benefits and who doesn't.
Right.
And I'm not saying I'm a big fan of Evo Morales, but it doesn't matter because the way that these things happen just fosters distrust in the region, and then I think that is ultimately more destructive than anything.
Yeah, I mean, you have basically a military coup, and now the damage is done,
Yeah,
right? Now
over,
we know,
right.
like, this OAS report is BS, right? It's been undermined not just by the study that New York Times wrote up, but by a number of studies and research that say basically it wasn't the election that was flawed, it was this OAS study that was the problem. But at this point, the damage is already done. So yeah, they come out now and they cover it. They never acknowledged that they bought it hook, line, and sinker and advocated for this essentially coup. So always great to have Glenn on these stories because he also had interviewed Morales in Mexico, so he had tremendous insights there. Jeffrey Epstein might be dead, but we are still learning about his alleged victims suffering. Our conversation with the director and executive producer behind Netflix's documentary series, Jeffrey Epstein, Filthy Rich, revealed why Epstein's inner circle still has not been prosecuted.
Well, I think, number one, he needed to be brought to justice first before the dominoes hopefully will start to fall afterwards. So, I mean, there is some sense of justice, obviously. The women would have liked to have seen him go to trial and rot in prison for the rest of his life. But until that happened, it was kind of brushed under the rug. People didn't really talk about it. It went away until really Alex Acosta became labor secretary, and that brought it back to life again. And scrutiny, and that really helped. The Miami Herald's story. We were digging in this documentary, and the focus became back on him. The FBI was always kind of looking a little bit, but that pressure, when it became kind of in the public knowledge again, was what enabled them to make that arrest. And I think Epstein, just could not handle being behind bars, and committed suicide.
Well, yeah, who knows about that last part? But I really appreciated her commentary there. She spent years investigating Jeffrey Epstein before this was even had come out. This 4-episode documentary on Netflix. I highly encourage everybody to watch it. I'm not nearly as optimistic though as Lisa. That Ghislaine Maxwell and all these other people.
She was fairly optimistic.
She was like, I think that
something's
going to happen. I'm like, I really just don't think so. And just given what happened with Epstein, given that Ghislaine Maxwell walks free, look at Prince Andrews basically getting away with not talking to the FBI, getting behind the palace walls. Nobody of power has ever been held to account for this story, and I just don't have a lot of faith that it's going to ultimately.
I think that's pretty fair.
Yeah.
That does it for us. We'll be back later today with the week that was in media screw-ups.
That's right. Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any of our videos, and don't forget to like and share as well. Tomorrow, going to be back for another round of #RisingQs. We'll see you guys then.